often we think that technology or information availability has created the largest shifts in the world of selling. I'm here to tell you that it turns out that legislation has caused more considerable shifts than either one. This today is an episode that is inspired by Dr. Peterson out of Indiana University, who had asked me about legislation and its impact on the sales profession. There aren't too many professions that have required the government to step in more than the sales profession. And so in today's episode, I'm going to take you back as early as the 1860s and show you how the sales profession has been changed more than any other way through government legislation.
There is nothing new in the world of sales except for the history you do not know. Welcome to the Sales History Podcast, bringing the brilliant and sometimes strange minds, methods, and ideas from the sales profession's past with applications to today. Here is your host, the best-selling author of 2 books with a third coming in January of 2026, CSP speaker, trainer, and nerd, Todd Caponi.
The sales profession is a profession that seemingly has always sought to push the boundaries to the point where some official body has had to jump in and say, okay, here's how you're allowed to do this. Much of how we sell has been shaped by laws designed to protect fair trade, pricing, consumers, and more recently, outreach. Would you like to learn a little bit more about the situations and relevant legislation? Well, let's go through them. So, going back to the 1860s, the Civil War had ended, the Industrial Revolution had just arrived, and the economy was exploding. You had railroads stretching from coast to coast, oil and steel production exploding, while the banking industry was consolidating around a few powerful families. Now, these companies, these powerful families, they got greedy, and in many cases, they realized they could all make more money by joining forces rather than competing with one another. So they formed trusts. So imagine the core steel businesses getting together, realizing the only way to get steel was from one of them. So they would agree on a floor by which prices would be set. Customers had no alternatives except through one of them. Or railroads getting together and all charging high rates. In some cases, they just carved up the country. You take the Midwest, we'll take the Northeast, etc. So they weren't competing against each other. John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil would come in and slash oil prices in local markets until the competitors went bankrupt, then raise the price up once they had a monopoly on that market. In some cases, the trusts would just buy out the smaller competitors and fold them in, so that before long, competition disappeared. By the 1880s, small businesses, and even more so farmers, they were outraged. The railroads were gouging the farmers' freight rates. The small businesses couldn't possibly compete with the massive organizations that were getting preferential pricing. The workers were getting sweatshop level pay, while the tycoons like Rockefeller, Carnegie, J.P. Morgan, Vanderbilt, they acquired unbelievable amounts of wealth. Along came the first significant piece of legislation that affected the sales profession. That was the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. Named after Senator John Sherman, the law was established to make illegal any, quote, contract, combination, or conspiracy in restraint of trade, and any attempt to monopolize or conspire to monopolize a market. It was written in a broad way so that courts could apply it in many until then not even imagined ways. Before the Sherman Act, salespeople didn't really have to sell. The businesses themselves controlled. Buyers had no alternatives. The Sherman Act was designed to open the door to competition to not only survive, but compete. The concept of actually differentiating in sales was born through the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. In a way, the Sherman Act, from what I can tell, kicked off the modern concept of sales. Just like how salespeople game their compensation plans, though, the industry gamed the Sherman Act. It was great theoretically, but because of the broadness by which it was written, it left massive holes, ones in which business leaders and lawyers figured out how to get around it. In some cases, companies flaunted the lack of teeth of the Sherman Act. In the October 20th, 1892 edition of the NCR, which was a newsletter that was sent to all of their salespeople, the edition's first paragraph reads, quote, "We have a monopoly. We propose to keep it. The government has given it to us through our patents. All of the requirements we ask of the salesman are energy, ability, and honesty." At first, the language was so broad that courts tended to side with the businesses, given the language did not have much meat. Second, while Sherman banned these trusts from forming and fixing prices, it didn't stop companies from giving special deals to squeeze out the small competitors in local markets. Third, Sherman didn't forbid companies from merging. In the early 1900s, there were huge consolidations in steel and tobacco, meatpacking, and banking. Owning 90% of the market wasn't a monopoly, according to the law. Fourth, there were problems being created by companies that were outside of the scope of monopolistic practices. And fifth, the Sherman Act actually crushed unions because when a union went on strike, that was considered, quote, a restraint of trade. So the monopolists continued to thrive while the union suffered. While Presidents Theodore Roosevelt and William Taft tried to use it to break up the giants to make selling easier and more accessible, they kept growing. So, along came in 1914 the second piece of legislation that impacted the sales profession, the Clayton Act. So, it wasn't until 1914 that the Clayton Act was enacted to spell things out. Price discrimination that lessened competition was banned. There were no more exclusive contracts that forced loyalty, and along with a number of other details that specifically gave salespeople and buyers a freer, fairer marketplace. Now, selling, especially in those industries, lent itself to lawyers writing contracts that gamed the Sherman Act. But now you won because your alignment to customer outcomes was better. Salespeople really needed to sharpen their skills, so the Clayton Act had a significant impact on the future of the sales profession. In that same year, along with the Clayton Act, came another significant shift that profoundly impacted the sales profession. If you've ever heard the phrase, quote, unfair or deceptive practices, the FTC was there to squash them. While Sherman and Clayton were about managing the competitive landscape, the Federal Trade Commission was all about truth in selling. Until 1914, the idea of patent medicines, also known as snake oil, was still a thing. Salespeople traveling around, as well as newspaper advertisements that promised miracle cures for everything from baldness to tuberculosis to, well, everything. Up until then, many of these snake oils contained things like alcohol, cocaine, or even opium. Remember, the original Coca-Cola formula had cocaine in it. These types of salespeople and advertisements caused addiction problems too. Testimonials were largely fake, and there were no ramifications for publishing them. Even doctor testimonials didn't have to come from actual doctors. Imagine that type of thing today, just totally making up case studies and endorsements. One of the more amazing stories I read was about a popular asthma cure that was advertised nationwide, but it was really just the smoke of burning paper. Inhale it as a cure. There were no regulations regarding ingredients in the things you purchased. Although the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 required labeling, telling the truth and said labeling wasn't yet a thing. Bait and switch selling was also popular at the time. Use a low-priced item to get someone interested, then tell the customer it's all sold out, but a more expensive version is available. The FTC's establishment put an end to all of that to essentially protect buyers from lies. And along with it, it also meant that salespeople couldn't just say anything to close a sale. Your claims must be backed by the truth. We were now full bore in an era of sales based on trust and credibility versus through deception. In 1930, 1936, another act came along that made an impact, and that was called the Robinson-Patman Act of 1936. Now, by the 1930s, the U.S. economy was deep into the Great Depression. People were struggling, small businesses were barely hanging on, and yet the big chain stores like A&P, Woolworths, and Sears were thriving. Because of their massive buying power, these chain stores could walk into a manufacturer's office and say, "Give us a better price or we'll take our business elsewhere." And the manufacturers, desperate to move product in a weak economy, gave in. They sold to the big chains at prices that were 10, 20, sometimes even 30% lower than when they charged local grocers or shopkeepers. Now, imagine that you're a small town grocer. You're buying canned goods from a wholesaler at, say, 15 cents a can. The A&P down the street is paying only 10 cents a can and then turning around and selling them to customers for 12 cents. That's cheaper than the small guys could even buy them for. There's no way that they could compete, and your customers, who are just as strapped for cash as you are, leave the store for the big chain. This wasn't just happening in groceries. It was playing out across retail, clothing, hardware, dry goods, you name it. And the cries of unfairness were getting louder. Small business argued that if this kept up, they'd all be wiped out, and America would be left with nothing but giant retailers. That's where the Robinson-Patman Act of 1936 came in. Sometimes called the Anti-Chain Store Act, it was designed to stop this kind of price discrimination. In plain language, it said, if you're a manufacturer, you can't sell the same product to two different buyers at two different prices if it hurts competition. And you can't give the big guys extra perks, like advertising allowances, display money, or free goods, unless those same opportunities are offered to the little guys too. So taking this to the sales profession, it essentially forced pricing consistency. Salespeople couldn't just walk into Sears and cut a special backroom deal. If they offered a discount, they needed a legitimate business reason, like actual cost savings from shipping in bulk, and they had to be ready to justify it. So with fair prices in play again, it also meant relationships mattered more than ever. If you couldn't win on price, you had to win on partnership. You had to show your small and mid-sized customers that you valued them, not just the chains. In a way, Robinson-Patman democratized selling, giving every company, big or small, a fair shot at competing in their market. Now, of course, that wasn't perfect either. Lawyers fought over what counted as fair discounts, and over time, enforcement waned. But in the late 1930s and through the 1940s, Robinson-Patman was a clear signal that the government was stepping in to keep salespeople from playing favorites and to protect the idea of a level playing field. Those represented the most significant of the early legislative acts that impacted the sales profession. There were certainly more, like the Miller-Tidings Act of 1937. This was essentially meant to stop the practice of retailers using loss leaders to bring people in. For example, you're a manufacturer, you advertise, you set a price. However, you lose control once the retailer takes it and sells it. The retailer decides, hey, let's advertise this product as being practically free to get people in the door, and then they'll buy other stuff. The manufacturer became irate at this practice because it cheapened their brand's perceived value. They didn't want to be a discount brand, so the act allowed manufacturers to set a minimum price a retailer could sell a product for. That's a big one. Very small, but big, and you'll hear about those implications here in a minute. There was the next year, the Wheeler-Lee Act of 1938. So while the FTC Act of 1914 was aimed to protect competition regarding misleading claims, Wheeler-Lee was designed specifically to protect the actual consumer. This one was a big one for brands as it relates to my bias, of course, towards transparency. Bold promises that couldn't be delivered quickly mean your business would be gone soon after. And then in 1950, there was something established called the Wage Stabilization Board. Now, this is a wild one. This didn't actually last. But listen to this. In World War II, inflation spiked, and along with it, wages also went up, based partially on a limit of labor due to the needs of the military. A low supply of workers equals a need to pay more for those workers, of course. However, as wages went up, a company's costs would go up, meaning they rose their own prices to maintain profitability. That's what causes uncapped inflation. Learning a lesson from that period, in 1950, the United States entered the Korean War. Harry S. Truman, then U.S. president, took proactive action and, among other things, enacted something called the Wage Stabilization Board. Its task? To control wages, or in other words, to keep wages from growing in order to keep inflation from spiraling out of control. So how would this be possible without creating a mutiny? Well, they established a board consisting of 18 individuals. It was tripartisan, so 3 groups of 6. Group 1 represented the public, Group 2 represented corporate management, and Group 3 represented labor. So why do I bring this up? Well, it's because the Wage Stabilization Board's powers included creating regulations around sales compensation. The do's and don'ts on sales salaries and commissions were very specific. Since it didn't last, I won't go into the details, but the regulations were tight. However, the sales organizations, of course, figured out a way to get around it too. And then there was one called the McGuire Amendment of 1952. This essentially reinforced Miller tidings by giving states the explicit authority to uphold those minimum price laws, even if federal antitrust rules would have said otherwise. For salespeople, this meant one thing: price stability. You could walk into a customer conversation confident that the price you set wasn't going to get blown up by a discounting retailer down the street. Margins were protected and brand reputation was preserved. It also meant you weren't discounting your way to deals. You had to win them over with service, availability, and relationship strength. However, there was one last big one. This one really set the stage for what we even talk about today, and this was the Consumer Goods Pricing Act of 1975. All right, so through the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, those fair trade laws like Miller Tidings and the McGuire Amendment gave manufacturers the power to set minimum resale prices. So that meant for decades, salespeople had a kind of safety net. If you sold a branded product, you knew retailers couldn't slash prices and drag you into a race to the bottom. Your job was to protect the brand, hold the line, and sell on value. But by the late 1960s and early 1970s, consumers were complaining of feeling trapped, and critics were agreeing. Why should consumers be forced to pay a set price for toothpaste or aspirin or a washing machine just because the manufacturer said so? Discount retailers were popping up, eager to compete on price. Places like Kmart and Walmart were gaining traction, but fair trade laws tied their hands. They couldn't use low prices to win business, even if their lower costs would allow it. Economists piled on too. They argued that fair trade laws kept prices artificially high, protected inefficient businesses, and hurt consumers. Free market ideology was on the rise, and Congress eventually agreed. So in 1975, the Consumer Goods Pricing Act repealed both Miller Tidings and McGuire. No more manufacturer set minimum retail prices. Retailers could charge whatever they wanted. For salespeople, this was a massive shift. Literally overnight, the price floor disappeared. Discounting wars began. If you were in sales in the late 70s, you suddenly faced buyers who'd say, "I saw this cheaper down the street. What can you do for me?" The impact? Well, negotiation suddenly became an essential salesperson skill. Before, you could point to the manufacturer's price as non-negotiable. After 1975, everything was on the table. Salespeople had to sharpen their ability to defend value, handle objections, and resist the race to the bottom. And because retail power surged, large discount chains could flex their buying power and pass savings to consumers, making them formidable customers. Salespeople found themselves negotiating not just on price, but on volume deals, shelf placement, and promotional support. In short, the Consumer Goods Pricing Act moved the burden from the law protecting your margins to you, the salesperson, protecting your value. The government stepped back, competition stepped in. Today, as I've argued many times, the buyer hasn't actually changed. They still make decisions the same way. Technology hasn't had the impact you think it might have. And if you don't believe me, go back and listen to a few of the old episodes of the Sales History Podcast. The biggest evolutionary driver to the sales profession has had more to do with the rules being changed than anything else. Before the Sherman Act, selling wasn't really selling as much as it was control and dominance. Every time things got out of hand, the government stepped in. Now, you've seen smaller hints of this over the past 40 years through things like the Telephone Consumer Protection Act of 1991 that was established to protect people from intrusive telemarketing. Things like automated dialers and pre-recorded message could only be used during certain times of the day. The Do Not Call Implementation Act of 2003. This was established as a joint effort between the FTC and the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, explicitly supported and funded by Congress. George W. Bush signed this one in 2003, authorizing the FTC to create a do not call registry. Violating this act could cost up to $50,000 in fines, according to the FTC. The Canned Spam Act of 2003, that same year, by the way, when considering forced acronyms, this one probably wins. It was called the Controlling the Assault of Non-Solicited Pornography and Marketing Act. This was also signed in 2003, and it set nationwide rules for commercial email. No more false or misleading headers, no deceptive subject lines, clear identification had to be in advertisements, the physical address had to be required, and opt-out required, so you'll see unsubscribe on all of these. It was meant to put an end to the Wild West of email selling. All of this legislation we've discussed today were designed to shed monopolies, eliminate bait and switch approaches, eliminate the practices of playing favorites with prices, and ultimately protect the consumer. What was left? Well, selling is what it was meant to be, based on trust, value, and transparency. Now, will there be legislation that changes things in the future? I'd absolutely bet on it. I mean, the rise of AI may require the same kind of scrutiny of the snake oil and patent medicines of the 1800s. There's a balance needed always between freedom and fairness. When there's too much freedom, the customer gets screwed. When there's too much regulation, competition is stifled. I would argue the laws will keep changing, but the principles that always last, being honest, transparent, and always having a service eye. What do you think? Do you believe that it's actually government legislation that probably had a bigger impact, in some cases overnight, on the sales profession than technology or information availability? I tend to think so, just from studying history, but I would love your feedback as always. I always appreciate the 5 stars or whatever the star rating you want to give it on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen. Please keep feeding me ideas. I've got a bunch. There's some great episodes coming that I can't wait to share with you. But until next time, what I most appreciate is you spending the time listening in. So thanks again.